Hi, I'm Zara. My sister Natalie thought it would be hilarious to humiliate me in front of my crush by sharing my most embarrassing childhood secret. She destroyed any chance I had with Tyler and laughed about it for weeks. But what she didn't know was that I had been quietly collecting evidence of her own dirty secrets, including the night she spent with her fiancé's brother just 2 weeks before her engagement party. Sometimes the quiet sister sees everything, and when you push someone too far, they push back twice as hard. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The autumn rain drummed against my dorm room window as I stared at the text message that would change everything between my sister and me forever. It was from Tyler Brooks, the guy I'd been building up the courage to talk to for 3 months. We'd finally connected over our shared love of vintage horror movies during a late-night study session at the campus library, and I thought maybe, just maybe, something real was starting to bloom between us. The message was short and devastating. Hey Zara, thanks for being honest about your situation. I think we should just stay friends though. Hope you understand. My hands trembled as I read it again, trying to decode what situation he could possibly be referring to. We'd had coffee twice, shared countless conversations about everything from Edgar Allan Poe to our favorite pizza toppings, and last weekend, he'd even walked me back to my dorm after a late movie screening, lingering at the entrance like he wanted to say something more. I'd gone to bed that night with butterflies dancing in my stomach, finally feeling like someone might actually see me as more than just Natalie's little sister. I called him immediately, my heart hammering against my ribs as the phone rang. When he picked up, his voice carried an awkwardness that hadn't been there before, like he was talking to a stranger instead of the girl he'd been texting goodnight to for the past 2 weeks. Tyler, I got your message, but I have no idea what you're talking about. What situation? There was a pause that stretched long enough for me to hear my roommate's Netflix show bleeding through the thin walls. Finally, he cleared his throat. Look, Zara, I really like you, but I can't handle the bedwetting thing. Natalie explained how it's been an ongoing issue for you, even through high school, and honestly, it's just not something I'm comfortable with in a relationship. The world tilted sideways. My vision blurred as the words hit me like a physical blow. Bedwetting. Natalie had told him about the bedwetting. Not just any bedwetting, but the specific incident from when I was 12 years old. The one that had happened during the worst week of my life when our parents were screaming at each other every night before their divorce was finalized. It was the secret I'd trusted her with during a vulnerable moment when I was crying in her room, terrified that something was wrong with me. Tyler, that was years ago when I was a kid dealing with my parents' divorce. It's not an ongoing issue. I can't believe she told you that. But even as I tried to explain, I could hear the doubt creeping into his voice, the way people sound when they're already forming an exit strategy. I don't know, Zara. She seemed pretty concerned about you. She said it happened all through high school and that you're really sensitive about it, which is why you never mentioned it to me yourself. The cruelty of it took my breath away. Natalie hadn't just shared an embarrassing childhood moment. She'd constructed an elaborate lie, painting me as someone with ongoing issues that I was supposedly hiding from potential romantic partners. She'd weaponized my trust and used it to destroy the first real connection I'd felt with someone in years. She's lying, Tyler. Please, just give me a chance to explain. I'm sorry, Zara. I really am. But I think it's best if we keep things friendly from here on out. The line went dead, and I sat there in the gray afternoon light, staring at my phone screen until it went black. The silence in my room felt oppressive, broken only by the steady patter of rain and the distant sound of students laughing in the hallway. I wanted to scream, to throw something, to call Natalie immediately and demand answers. Instead, I found myself doing something I hadn't done since I was that 12-year-old girl crying in her bedroom. I cried until my chest ached and my eyes were swollen shut. When my roommate Priya returned from her afternoon classes, she found me curled up on my bed, clutching a pillow and staring at the wall with the hollow expression of someone who'd just discovered that the person they trusted most in the world was capable of unimaginable betrayal. "Zara, what happened? You look like someone died." I told her everything, from the months of careful conversation building with Tyler to the devastating phone call that had just ended any possibility of something beautiful growing between us. Priya listened with the kind of focused attention that reminded me why she was studying to become a therapist, her dark eyes never leaving my face as I recounted every painful detail. "That's absolutely vicious," she said when I finished. "Who does that to their own sister? And over what? Jealousy?" That question hung in the air between us, but deep down, I already knew the answer. Natalie had always been the golden child, the one who excelled effortlessly at everything she touched. She was studying psychology with a focus on family therapy, volunteering at the campus crisis center, and planning her dream wedding to Derek Hamilton, whose family owned half the commercial real estate in Cedar Valley. She was everything our mother had always wanted in a daughter: confident, successful, and blessed with the kind of natural charisma that drew people to her like moths to a flame. But lately, something had changed in our dynamic. For the first time in my life, I was finding my own path, building my own connections, creating my own small corner of happiness that had nothing to do with being Natalie's little sister. My digital marketing projects were getting recognition from professors. I'd landed a competitive internship with a local tech startup. And most importantly, I'd been developing genuine friendships and even a potential romance that existed entirely, separate from Natalie's sphere of influence. Maybe that was threatening to her. Maybe she couldn't stand the idea of me having something she hadn't given me permission to have. "I trusted her," I whispered, more to myself than to Priya. When I told her about that night when I was 12, I was so scared and ashamed. She held me while I cried and promised she'd never tell anyone. She said sisters had to protect each other's secrets. Priya's expression hardened. Well, clearly that promise meant nothing to her. The question is, what are you going to do about it? I didn't have an answer then. I felt too raw, too devastated to think beyond the immediate pain of losing Tyler and the profound betrayal of discovering what Natalie was truly capable of. But as the evening wore on and the initial shock began to crystallize into something sharper and more focused, I realized that this wasn't just about one cruel moment. This was about a pattern I'd been too naive or too hopeful to recognize. I started thinking about other times when opportunities had mysteriously evaporated, when people I'd been getting close to had suddenly grown distant or cold. The guy from my freshman year chemistry class who'd asked me to study together and then never spoke to me again after spring break. The girl from my residence hall who'd invited me to join her friend group and then seemed to forget I existed after she met Natalie at a campus event. The internship coordinator who'd seemed enthusiastic about my application until she mentioned she'd had a long conversation with my sister about my capabilities. How many times had Natalie quietly sabotaged me while wearing the mask of a caring older sister? How many connections had she poisoned with carefully placed seeds of doubt or embarrassing revelations shared under the guise of concern? My phone buzzed with a text from Natalie herself, as if she could sense that her latest manipulation had found its target. "Heard you and Tyler decided to stay friends, probably for the best. College relationships rarely work out anyway. Love. You, sis." The casual cruelty of it made my hands shake. She wasn't even trying to hide her satisfaction. She knew exactly what she'd done, and she was reveling in the success of her sabotage. I showed the message to Priya, who read it with increasing disgust. "She's proud of herself. Look at that tone. She's not even pretending to be sympathetic." "What kind of person does this to their own family?" I asked, though I wasn't really expecting an answer. Priya was quiet for a long moment, then looked at me with the kind of intensity that made me understand why her professors were already talking about her potential for clinical work. "The kind of person who's hiding something bigger. Nobody goes. to these lengths to tear someone else down unless they're terrified of their own secrets coming to light. Her words echoed in my mind long after she'd gone to bed that night. As I lay awake staring at the ceiling, I began to think about what I actually knew about Natalie's life versus what she allowed me to see. She was always so carefully curated, so perfectly assembled, like a social media profile come to life. But real people weren't that flawless, which meant she had to be working very hard to maintain that image. What was she hiding? What secrets was she protecting so fiercely that she felt the need to preemptively destroy my credibility? The next morning brought an unexpected opportunity to find out. I was walking to my early marketing seminar when I ran into Marcus Chen, a mutual friend who'd known both Natalie and me since high school. He looked troubled, like someone wrestling with a decision he didn't want to make. "Zara, hey. Can I talk to you for a minute?" We ducked into the campus coffee shop, and Marcus ordered 2 lattes while I waited, studying his expression. He'd always been straightforward, the kind of guy who said what he meant and meant what he said, which made his obvious discomfort all the more concerning. "This is really awkward," he began, sliding my drink across the small table. "But I heard about what happened with Tyler, and I think there's something you should know." My stomach dropped. What kind of something? Marcus glanced around the coffee shop like he was worried about being overheard, then leaned closer. "It's about Natalie, about her and Derek." Derek Hamilton was Natalie's fiancé, the golden boy heir to a real estate empire who'd proposed to her in a grand gesture that had been featured in the local newspaper's society section. They were planning a spring wedding that our mother had been obsessing over for months, complete with a reception at the country club and a honeymoon in Europe that Derek's family was paying for. What about them? Marcus took a deep breath. "I was at a party 2 weeks ago at Derek's fraternity house. It was late, maybe 2 in the morning, and I went upstairs to use the bathroom because the one downstairs was occupied. I walked past Derek's room and heard sounds." Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. "You know what I mean?" I nodded, though I wasn't sure where this was heading. The door was cracked open and I could see inside. It wasn't Derek in there with Natalie. It was Kyle. Kyle Hamilton, Derek's younger brother, the one who dropped out of business school to pursue music and drove Derek's parents crazy with his refusal to conform to their expectations. I'd met him a few times at family gatherings, and he'd always struck me as the opposite of his older brother. Creative, rebellious, and completely uninterested in the family business. "Are you sure it was them?" Marcus nodded grimly. "Positive." I know I should have said something then, but I didn't know what to do. Derek's a good guy, and Kyle's been dealing with addiction issues. I thought maybe it was a one-time mistake, something that would never happen again. The implications hit me like a tidal wave. Natalie wasn't just engaged to Derek. She was cheating on him with his own brother. The perfect relationship that she flaunted at every opportunity. The engagement that had made our mother weep with pride. The wedding that was supposed to cement her status as Cedar Valley royalty. It was all built on a foundation of lies. "But then I heard about what she did to you," Marcus continued, "and I realized that maybe this isn't about protecting Derek's feelings anymore. Maybe it's about making sure someone as manipulative as Natalie doesn't get away with destroying other people while hiding her own secrets." I sat back in my chair, my mind racing with the possibilities. This wasn't just gossip or speculation. This was concrete evidence of hypocrisy that could shatter Natalie's carefully constructed image. She'd spent years positioning herself as the moral center of our family, the responsible one who made good choices and could be trusted with important decisions. She'd even chosen to study family therapy, presenting herself as someone who understood the importance of trust and communication in relationships. Meanwhile, she was systematically sabotaging my attempts at happiness while betraying her fiancé with his own brother. "Why are you telling me this?" I asked, though I was already beginning to form the outline of an idea. Marcus shrugged. "Because what she did to you was cruel, and because Derek deserves to know the truth before he marries someone who's capable of that level of deception. I've been carrying this around for 2 weeks, and it's eating me alive." I understood that feeling. Secrets had weight, and when you carried someone else's secret, especially one that could hurt innocent people, it became a burden that grew heavier with each passing day. "Have you seen them together since then? Kyle and Natalie?" "Not at the same party, but I've noticed things. The way they look at each other when they think no one's watching. How Kyle always seems to disappear when Derek brings Natalie around. The family house. Little things that make sense now that I know what to look for." After Marcus left for his own classes, I sat in the coffee shop for another hour, nursing my latte and processing everything I'd learned. The contrast between Natalie's public image and her private actions was staggering. She presented herself as someone who valued honesty and family loyalty, someone who could be trusted with the most intimate details of other people's lives. In reality, she was a master manipulator who thought nothing of destroying relationships to maintain her own advantage. But now I had something she didn't know I had: the truth about her own vulnerabilities. For the first time since Tyler's devastating phone call, I felt something other than hurt and confusion. I felt a quiet, steady sense of purpose settling into my chest like a flame finding its wick. Natalie had spent years making me feel small, insignificant, like my feelings and experiences didn't matter. She'd systematically undermined my confidence and sabotaged my relationships while positioning herself as the loving, concerned sister who only wanted what was best for me. Now, I understood that her need to diminish me wasn't about love or concern. It was about control. She needed me to stay small so that her own secrets would remain safe, so that I would never develop the confidence or connections necessary to challenge her carefully maintained facade. But people who lived in glass houses shouldn't throw stones, and Natalie had just shattered mine with the biggest rock she could find. The question was no longer whether I would respond to her attack. The question was how strategically I could expose the truth about who she really was. I pulled out my phone and started a new note, titling it simply, "Evidence." Then I began typing everything Marcus had told me, complete with dates, times, and specific details. This wasn't about revenge, in the petty sense. This was about justice, about making sure that someone who thought she could manipulate and hurt people without consequences finally faced the truth about her own actions. Natalie had taught me an important lesson about trust and family loyalty. She'd shown me exactly what happened when someone decided that their own comfort was more important than the well-being of the people who loved them. Now it was time for me to teach her a lesson in return. The rain had stopped by the time I finally left the coffee shop, and weak afternoon sunlight was filtering through the clouds, casting everything in sharp relief. As I walked back toward my dorm, I felt something I hadn't experienced in years. Complete clarity about who I was and what I needed to do. Natalie thought she could control me by controlling my narrative, by deciding which of my stories got told and how they were framed. She thought she could keep me dependent on her approval by systematically destroying my independent relationships and achievements, but she'd made one crucial mistake. She'd assumed that I would always be the scared 12-year-old girl who needed her protection and guidance. She'd forgotten that I'd grown up, that I'd developed my own skills and insights, and that I'd learned to see through the very manipulation techniques she'd been using against me for years. Most importantly, she'd forgotten that quiet people aren't weak people. We just choose our battles more carefully. And this battle was going to be worth the wait. The digital marketing lab was nearly empty when I slipped inside at 7 in the morning, 2 days after my conversation with Marcus. I'd barely slept, my mind churning with fragments of plans and half-formed strategies. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead as I settled at a computer workstation in the back corner. pulling up social media monitoring software that I'd learned to use for my internship. If Natalie had secrets, there would be digital breadcrumbs. People like her, who lived their lives as carefully curated performances, couldn't resist documenting everything. The trick was knowing where to look and what patterns to identify. I started with her Instagram account, scrolling back through months of perfectly filtered photos. There was the engagement announcement, complete with a professional photographer, and a sunset backdrop at the country club. The ring reveal, shot from 3 different angles. Countless couple photos with Derek at charity events, family dinners, and weekend getaways to his parents' lake house. But as I studied the timestamps and locations more carefully, interesting gaps began to emerge. There were several weekends where Natalie had posted photos suggesting she was at our parents' house in Cedar Valley, while Derek's social media showed him attending family events or business functions without her. During those same weekends, Kyle Hamilton's Instagram stories showed him at local venues around town, usually late-night concerts or underground art shows that were decidedly not Derek's scene. I opened a spreadsheet and began cross-referencing dates, locations, and social media activity. The pattern became clearer with each entry. Whenever Derek was out of town for business or family obligations, Natalie would create an excuse to stay behind, usually claiming work commitments or study groups. During those same periods, Kyle would be conspicuously active on social media in Cedar Valley, posting from coffee shops, galleries, and music venues that Natalie had never publicly visited, but that showed up in the background of some of her more candid Instagram stories. My phone buzzed with a text from Priya. "Coffee before class? You look like you could use some friendly support." I saved my work and met her at our usual spot, a small cafe off campus that served Ethiopian coffee and stayed mercifully free of undergraduate drama. Priya took one look at my face and ordered me a double shot. "You've been researching," she said, settling into the worn leather chair across from me. "I can see it in your eyes, that focused intensity you get when you're solving a complex problem." I showed her what I'd discovered so far, watching her expression shift from curiosity to fascination to something approaching concern. "This is really sophisticated detective work," she said finally. "But Zara, what exactly are you planning to do with this information?" The question had been nagging at me since I'd started digging. Part of me wanted immediate satisfaction, the kind of explosive confrontation that would expose Natalie's hypocrisy in the most public and humiliating way possible. But my marketing training had taught me the value of strategic timing and audience analysis. A premature reveal could backfire, making me look vindictive while allowing Natalie to spin herself as the victim of a jealous sister's accusations. "I need more than circumstantial evidence," I said. "Social media patterns and timeline coincidences aren't enough to prove anything definitively. I need something concrete." Priya leaned forward, lowering her voice. "How concrete are we talking? Because there's a difference between exposing the truth and engaging in actually questionable behavior." She was right to be cautious. The last thing I wanted was to become the kind of person who justified unethical actions by pointing to someone else's wrongdoing. But I also couldn't shake the image of Derek, kind and trusting Derek, planning a future with someone who was systematically deceiving him while destroying other people's happiness for sport. "I'm not going to do anything illegal or invasive," I assured her. "But I am going to pay closer attention to public information and social situations. If Natalie and Kyle are as reckless as Marcus suggested, they'll reveal themselves eventually." That opportunity came sooner than I expected. Thursday evening, Derek posted a story about flying to Portland for a weekend business conference, complete with a photo of his boarding pass and a caption about missing Natalie already. Within hours, Natalie had posted her own story about a quiet weekend planned with textbooks and herbal tea, using the hashtag study mode, and a photo of her psychology materials artfully arranged on her desk. But Kyle's Instagram story told a different tale. He'd posted a photo of 2 concert tickets, to an indie band performing at a small venue downtown with the caption, "Finally someone who appreciates real music." The timestamp showed he'd posted it just 20 minutes after Natalie's studious study session announcement. I screenshot everything and added it to my growing documentation file. Then, on impulse, I decided to conduct a small experiment in field research. The venue was exactly what I'd expected: exposed brick walls, dim lighting, and the kind of aggressively artistic atmosphere that attracted people who took pride in not being mainstream. I'd dressed carefully, choosing dark clothing that would help me blend into the shadows, and arrived early enough to secure a spot near the back where I could observe without being easily noticed. Kyle arrived first, just after 9, looking every inch the brooding artist in ripped jeans and a vintage band t-shirt that probably cost more than my textbooks. He ordered a whiskey neat and positioned himself near the stage, checking his phone periodically with the kind of restless energy that suggested he was waiting for someone. Natalie appeared 20 minutes later, and the transformation was startling. Gone was the preppy psychology student with her cardigans and pearl earrings. This version of my sister wore black leather pants, a flowing silk top that suggested rather than revealed, and makeup that emphasized her eyes in a way that was both subtle and magnetic. She'd even done something different with her hair, loosening it from its usual controlled waves into something wilder and more natural. She moved through the crowd like she belonged there, nodding to a few people and accepting a drink from Kyle with the easy familiarity of someone who'd done this many times before. When the band started playing, they positioned themselves close, together, not quite touching, but sharing the kind of intimate space that spoke of deeper connection. I watched them for over an hour, documenting their interactions with my phone's camera from a discreet distance. The way Kyle's hand rested on the small of her back when someone pushed past them in the crowd. How Natalie leaned into him during quieter songs, her lips close enough to his ear to suggest whispered conversations that had nothing to do with the music. The moment when their fingers intertwined during a particularly emotional ballad, held for just long enough to confirm that this wasn't casual friendship. But the most damning evidence came near the end of the night, when they thought the crowd provided sufficient cover for more intimate contact. Kyle pulled Natalie against him during the final song, and she responded by sliding her arms around his neck, their bodies pressed together in a way that left no doubt about the nature of their relationship. When the music ended and the lights came up, they separated quickly, but not before sharing a look of such raw intimacy that it made my stomach turn. They left separately, Kyle first and Natalie following about 10 minutes later, but I saw them reunite in the parking lot. Behind the venue, Kyle's motorcycle was parked in the shadows between two larger vehicles, and Natalie climbed on behind him without hesitation, her arms wrapping around his waist as they disappeared into the night. I sat in my car for a long time afterward, processing what I'd witnessed. This wasn't a moment of weakness or a single mistake born of too much alcohol and poor judgment. This was an established relationship, complete with practiced deception and carefully coordinated alibis. Natalie had essentially been living a double life, maintaining her engagement to Derek while conducting what appeared to be a serious affair with his brother. The next morning brought a text from Natalie that made my discoveries even more surreal. Had such a productive study session last night. Sometimes you need complete quiet to really focus, you know? Hope your week is going well. The casual dishonesty was breathtaking. She'd sent that message while probably still lying in Kyle's bed, constructing an elaborate fiction about her evening that positioned her as the dedicated student burning the midnight oil in pursuit of academic excellence. I forwarded the message to Priya along with some of the photos I'd taken the night before. Her response came back within minutes. "Holy shit, Zara. This is so much worse than we thought. She's not just cheating on Derek, she's gaslighting him about her entire personality. Did you see how different she looked?" That transformation had been haunting me since I'd witnessed it. The Natalie I'd observed at the concert wasn't just dressed differently. She'd been moving differently, talking differently, even holding. herself with a confidence that seemed more authentic than the carefully modulated version she presented to Derek and our family. It made me wonder which version was real, or if both were just different performances designed to manipulate different audiences. My phone rang while I was reviewing the photos for the third time. Marcus's name appeared on the screen, and I answered immediately. "Zara, I need to tell you something else. I probably should have mentioned it when we talked before, but I wasn't sure if it was relevant." "What is it?" "Derek asked me to be his best man last week. The wedding's in 4 months, and he's been talking about how excited he is to start his life with Natalie. He keeps saying how lucky he is to have found someone so genuine and trustworthy." The irony was nauseating. Derek was planning to stand in front of his family and friends and pledge his life to someone who was systematically deceiving him about fundamental aspects of her character. Meanwhile, Natalie was probably already planning how to continue her affair after the wedding, confident that her new status as Derek's wife would provide even better cover for her deception. "Marcus, I have to show you something." We met at the campus library an hour later, and I walked him through everything I'd discovered: the social media analysis, the timeline correlations, and finally the photos from the concert. His face grew darker with each revelation, and by the time I finished, he looked physically ill. I knew something felt off, but seeing the evidence like this— He shook his head. "Derek's my friend, Zara. He's a good guy who genuinely loves her, and she's making a fool of him while planning to take his family's name." "The question is what we do about it," I said, "because this goes way beyond just exposing Natalie for what she did to me. Derek deserves to know who he's really marrying." Marcus was quiet for a long moment, staring at the photos on my laptop screen. Finally, he looked up at me with an expression of grim resolve. "We need more evidence. Something undeniable that she can't explain away or blame on misunderstandings. If we're going to blow up Derek's world, we need to make sure we can prove every single thing we're telling him." He was right, but the prospect of gathering more evidence meant continuing to watch my sister deceive someone who trusted her completely. It meant documenting the destruction of Derek's faith in real time while knowing I had the power to stop it, but choosing to wait for the perfect moment instead. "There's something else," Marcus continued. "Derek mentioned that Natalie's been pushing to move the wedding up. She wants to have it in December instead of April, claiming it's for financial reasons, but now I'm wondering if there's another motive." A chill ran down my spine. If Natalie was trying to accelerate the timeline, it might mean she knew her double life was becoming harder to maintain. Or worse, it might mean she was pregnant and trying to secure Derek's commitment before the truth became impossible to hide. "We need to be careful," I said. "If she suspects that someone's watching her, she might become more cautious or find ways to discredit us before we can present our evidence." But even as I said it, I realized that my own transformation was becoming harder to hide. The quiet, accommodating sister who had spent years absorbing Natalie's manipulation without fighting back was evolving into someone more strategic and determined. Eventually, she would notice that change, and when she did, she would recognize the threat it represented. That afternoon, I received an unexpected text from Derek himself. "Hey, Zara. Natalie mentioned you've been feeling a bit down lately. Want to grab coffee this weekend? I know how much you mean to her, and I'd love to get to know my future sister-in-law better." The message was a masterpiece of Natalie's manipulation. By framing my recent behavior as feeling down, she'd positioned herself as the caring sister who was concerned about my emotional state. Meanwhile, Derek's offer to spend time with me was probably her idea, designed to keep me close enough to monitor while making herself look generous and family-oriented. But it also presented an opportunity. If Derek wanted to get to know me better, maybe it was time for him to understand exactly what kind of person he was planning to marry. I texted back accepting his invitation, and we arranged to meet at a coffee shop downtown Saturday afternoon. As I put my phone away, I realized that I was no longer simply gathering evidence in preparation for some future confrontation. I was actively engaged in a careful, methodical campaign to expose the truth about Natalie's character and her systematic deception of everyone who trusted her. The scared, ashamed 12-year-old who had confided her most vulnerable moment to her sister was gone. In her place was someone who understood that justice sometimes required patience, strategy, and the willingness to watch your enemies destroy themselves while you carefully documented every step of their downfall. Natalie had taught me that family loyalty was conditional, that trust could be weaponized, and that the people who claimed to love you most were often the ones most willing to sacrifice your happiness for their own convenience. Now I was going to teach her what happened when the quiet sister finally decided to speak up. Saturday's coffee meeting with Derek took place at a bustling cafe in the historic district, the kind of place that attracted young professionals and college students with its exposed brick walls and artisanal pastries. Derek arrived first, already seated at a corner table with 2 lattes, and what appeared to be genuine enthusiasm for our conversation. He was exactly as I remembered from family gatherings, earnest, well-dressed in the effortless way that suggested good breeding rather than conscious effort, and possessed of the kind of open smile that made you understand why Natalie had targeted him in the first place. There was something inherently trustworthy about Derek Hamilton, a quality that made you want to confide in him and believe that he would handle your confidences with care, which made what Natalie was doing to him even more despicable. "Zara, I'm so glad you agreed to meet," he said, standing to give me a brief hug. "I feel like I've been so busy with work and wedding planning that I haven't really gotten to know the people who matter most to Natalie." The irony of that statement would have been funny if it weren't so tragic. Derek was working overtime to build relationships with Natalie's family while she was busy destroying his trust with his own brother. He was planning a wedding that represented his commitment to honesty and partnership while she was constructing elaborate lies about her. "Fundamental character? I've been meaning to reach out too," I said, settling into my chair and studying his expression. "There's actually something I've been wanting to talk to you about." Derek leaned forward with the kind of focused attention that suggested he was genuinely interested in whatever I had to say. It was a quality I'd noticed about him before. Unlike Natalie, who always seemed to be performing even during intimate conversations, Derek appeared to actually listen when people spoke to him. "Natalie mentioned that you might be dealing with some personal stuff," he said. "I know how close you two are, and I want you to know that I'm here if you need someone to talk to. Family is really important to me, and I want to make sure you feel supported." The concern in his voice was so genuine that I felt a stab of guilt for what I was about to put him through. But that guilt was quickly overshadowed by anger at Natalie for putting us all in this position in the first place. She was the one who had chosen deception over honesty, manipulation over genuine connection. Any pain that resulted from exposing her choices was a consequence of her own actions, not mine. "Actually, Derek, the personal stuff I've been dealing with involves Natalie herself." His expression shifted slightly, becoming more cautious but still open. "Oh, is everything okay between you two?" I chose my words carefully, knowing that this conversation could determine how receptive he would be to more serious revelations later. "I've been discovering some things about my sister that have been difficult to process. Things that make me question whether I know her as well as I thought I did." Derek's brow furrowed. "What kind of things?" "Have you ever noticed that Natalie seems to become a different person depending on who she's with? Like she adapts her personality to match what she thinks people want from her?" He was quiet for a moment, and I could see him mentally reviewing his experiences with Natalie through this new lens. I mean, everyone adjusts their behavior somewhat based on social context. That's just normal social intelligence. "I'm talking about something more fundamental than that," I said. "I'm talking about constructing entirely different identities, different value systems, even different interests depending on the audience." Derek's discomfort was becoming more apparent, but he wasn't shutting down the conversation. "Can you give me an example of what you mean?" This was the moment I'd been preparing for, the opportunity to plant the first seed of doubt without revealing the full scope of what I knew. "How much do you know about Natalie's taste in music?" "Her taste in music?" He looked confused by the apparent non sequitur. "She's not really into music. She finds most contemporary stuff too loud or aggressive, and she prefers quiet environments where she can think. She's more of a classical music person when she listens to anything at all." I pulled out my phone and showed him one of Kyle's Instagram stories from the previous weekend, the one featuring the concert tickets. "This is from last Saturday night. Does this look like the kind of event Natalie would enjoy?" Derek studied the image, his expression growing more puzzled. "No, definitely not. This looks like exactly the kind of thing she would hate. Why are you showing me this?" "Because I have reason to believe she was there." The silence that followed was heavy with implications that Derek wasn't ready to fully acknowledge. I could see him struggling to reconcile the Natalie he knew with the possibility that she might attend underground concerts while claiming to prefer quiet study sessions. "I don't understand," he said finally. "Are you saying she lied about her plans that night?" "I'm saying that there might be aspects of Natalie's life that you're not aware of, aspects that she's chosen not to share with you." Derek's discomfort was now clearly mixed with something approaching alarm. "Zara, if you know something specific about Natalie, I think you should just tell me directly instead of talking in riddles." He was right, but I wasn't ready to reveal everything yet. The evidence I'd gathered was compelling, but I needed to be absolutely certain that Derek would be receptive to the truth before I showed him photos of his fiancé in another man's arms. "I will tell you directly," I said. "But first, I need to ask you something, and I need you to be completely honest with me." Derek nodded, though his expression suggested he was bracing himself for something he didn't want to hear. "Have there been times when Natalie's behavior or explanations didn't quite add up? Moments when you felt like something was off, but you dismissed the feeling because you trusted her?" He was quiet for a long time, and I could see the internal struggle playing out across his features. Finally, he spoke in a voice that was barely above a whisper. "Sometimes I feel like she's performing for me instead of just being herself. Like she's trying so hard to be the perfect girlfriend that I never get to see who she really is underneath all that effort." The admission seemed to surprise him as much as it relieved me. Derek had been sensing the deception, even if he hadn't consciously acknowledged it. His instincts had been trying to warn him that something fundamental was wrong with his relationship, but his trust in Natalie had been overriding those warnings. "What if I told you that the performance you've been sensing isn't just about being the perfect girlfriend?" I asked. "What if it's about hiding entire aspects of her personality and her behavior?" Derek's hands were shaking slightly as he reached for his coffee cup. "I would ask you to show me whatever evidence you think you have." I opened my laptop and began walking him through my documentation, starting with the social media analysis and building toward the more damning evidence. I watched his face carefully as each piece of information registered, noting how his expression shifted from confusion to concern to something approaching devastation. When I showed him the photos from the concert, the ones that clearly depicted Natalie and Kyle in intimate contact, Derek's face went completely white. He stared at the screen for a long time without speaking, and I could see him mentally rewriting every interaction he'd had with his brother and his fiancé over the past few months. "This is Kyle," he said finally, his voice hollow. "She's been cheating on me with my own brother." The pain in his voice was so raw that I almost regretted showing him the truth. Almost. But then I remembered Tyler's confused rejection, the years of subtle sabotage, and the countless ways Natalie had manipulated people who trusted her, and my resolve hardened. "I'm sorry, Derek. I know this is incredibly painful to see." He closed the laptop gently and leaned back in his chair, staring at the ceiling as if it might contain some explanation for what he'd just learned. How long has this been going on? Based on what I've been able to document, at least several months, maybe longer. Derek's laugh was bitter and completely devoid of humor. I've been planning our future while she's been sleeping with Kyle. I've been telling my parents how excited I am to marry someone who shares my values, someone honest and trustworthy. Derek, I'm sorry you had to find out this way, but I thought you deserved to know before you made any permanent commitments. He nodded slowly, still processing the implications. My whole family loves her. My parents have been bragging to their friends about how lucky I am to have found such a wonderful woman. Kyle has been acting like the supportive brother, even offering to help with wedding planning. The scope of the deception was staggering. Natalie and Kyle hadn't just been conducting an affair, they'd been systematically lying to Derek's entire family while accepting their love, support, and financial contributions to a wedding that was built on fraud. "What are you going to do?" I asked. Derek was quiet for a long time before answering. "I need to think. I need to process this and figure out how to handle it without destroying my entire family in the process." I understood his dilemma. Exposing Natalie and Kyle would inevitably hurt innocent people, including Derek's parents and the extended family members who had invested emotionally and financially in the upcoming wedding. But allowing the deception to continue would only make the eventual truth more devastating for everyone involved. "Take the time you need," I said. "But Derek, you should know that this goes beyond just the affair. Natalie has a pattern of manipulating people who care about her. What she's doing to you isn't an isolated incident." As we parted ways that afternoon, I could see that Derek was beginning to understand the full scope of what he'd discovered. He wasn't just learning about infidelity. He was learning that the woman he'd planned to spend his life with was capable of systematic, calculated deception on a scale that called into question everything he thought he knew about her character. The quiet, strategic campaign I'd been waging against Natalie's manipulation was finally beginning to bear fruit. Soon, she would be forced to confront the consequences of her choices, and the careful facade she'd constructed would crumble under the weight of documented truth. But first, I had one more conversation to navigate, one more relationship to protect from her destructive influence. It was time to talk to our mother. Sunday evening found me sitting in my rental car outside my mother's house on Maple Street, watching the warm glow of her living room windows and gathering the courage for what might be the most difficult conversation of my life. The house looked exactly as it had throughout my childhood, modest but well-maintained, with the rose bushes she'd planted after the divorce now climbing toward the second-story windows in wild profusion. Mom had always been Natalie's biggest champion, the one who excused her eldest daughter's occasional cruelties as signs of ambition and celebrated her achievements as reflections of superior parenting. Convincing her that Natalie was capable of systematic deception would require more than just evidence. It would require dismantling decades of carefully constructed mythology about which daughter was reliable and which one was prone to dramatic overreactions. My phone buzzed with a text from Derek. "Can't stop thinking about what you showed me. Need to talk to Kyle before I make any decisions. Thank you for telling me the truth, even though it's destroying everything I thought I knew." The pain in his message was palpable, but so was his determination to handle the situation with integrity. It reminded me why he deserved better than what Natalie was giving him, and it strengthened my resolve to protect other innocent people from her manipulation. I climbed the front steps and used my key, calling out as I entered. "Mom, it's me. I brought dinner from that Thai place you like." Carol Winters emerged from the kitchen wearing the floral apron I'd given her for Mother's Day 3 years ago, her graying hair pulled back in the practical ponytail she favored for cooking. At 54, she maintained the kind of understated elegance that came from good bones and careful grooming rather than expensive clothes or cosmetic procedures. "Zara, sweetie, what a lovely surprise. I was just making myself a sad little sandwich for dinner." "Aunt?" She accepted my hug with the warmth that had always made me feel safe as a child. before I'd learned that unconditional love could coexist with conditional approval. We settled at the kitchen table with our pad thai and spring rolls, engaging in the kind of comfortable small talk that had characterized our relationship since I'd moved away for college. Mom updated me on neighborhood gossip and her volunteer work at the animal shelter, while I shared carefully edited highlights from my classes and internship. But underneath the familiar rhythm of our conversation, I could feel the weight of what I needed to tell her. Every mundane detail we discussed felt like a lie of omission, a betrayal of the trust that had always existed between us even when her loyalty was divided. Mom, I need to talk to you about something serious. About Natalie. Her expression immediately shifted to the defensive posture I'd learned to recognize over the years. It was the same look she'd worn when teachers called about Natalie's tendency to blame group project failures on other students, or when neighbors mentioned seeing her sneaking out after curfew. "Oh, honey, you know how you can be sometimes? You get these ideas about your sister that aren't really fair to her. She's been so worried about you lately, especially after that situation with Tyler." The casual mention of Tyler felt like a slap. Of course, Natalie had shared her version of that story with Mom, probably framing it as concern for my emotional well-being rather than acknowledging her role in destroying a relationship that had been important to me. What exactly did Natalie tell you about Tyler? Mom's discomfort was evident as she pushed her food around her plate. She said you'd been dating someone who wasn't really appropriate for you, and that when she tried to give you some gentle guidance about it, you got upset and blamed her for the relationship ending. The revision was masterful. In Natalie's version, she'd been the caring sister offering wise counsel, while I was the emotionally unstable one who couldn't handle constructive feedback. My humiliation had been transformed into her heroic attempt to protect me from my own poor judgment. Mom, that's not what happened. Natalie deliberately sabotaged my relationship with Tyler by telling him lies about me. Personal, embarrassing, lies that she knew would make him uncomfortable. Oh, Zara. Mom's voice carried the patient tone she'd always used when she thought I was being overly dramatic. Why would Natalie do something like that? She loves you. She's always looked out for you. This was the fundamental challenge I'd known I would face. Mom's entire understanding of our family dynamic was built on the premise that Natalie was the responsible, caring older sister who sometimes had to make difficult decisions for everyone's good, suggesting that Natalie might be motivated by jealousy or cruelty contradicted decades of established narrative. Because she doesn't want me to have relationships that don't depend on her approval. Because she needs to be the center of everyone's attention, including mine. Mom set down her fork and looked at me with the kind of gentle concern that made me feel like I was 7 years old again, crying about some perceived unfairness that adults understood better than I did. Sweetheart, I think you might be projecting some of your own insecurities onto Natalie. She's planning a wedding, finishing her degree, and managing a lot of stress. Maybe what you interpreted as sabotage was just her being distracted, or not thinking through how her words might affect you. The psychological analysis stung because it was so perfectly crafted to make me doubt my own perceptions. Mom wasn't just defending Natalie. She was subtly suggesting that my reactions were rooted in personal failings rather than legitimate grievances. What if I could prove to you that Natalie has been systematically lying to everyone, including Derek? What if I could show you evidence that she's been living a completely different life than the one she presents to our family? Mom's expression hardened slightly. Zara, I don't like where this conversation is going. Your sister is about to marry a wonderful man who adores her, and I won't have you trying to destroy her happiness because you're dealing with your own relationship disappointments. The dismissal was everything I'd feared and expected. Mom had invested so much emotional energy in celebrating Natalie's engagement and upcoming wedding that she couldn't afford to consider the possibility that it might be built on deception. Acknowledging Natalie's capacity for manipulation would require her to question her own judgment and admit that she'd been enabling destructive behavior for years. But I'd come too far to retreat now. I opened my laptop and began showing her the same evidence I'd presented to Derek, starting with the social media analysis and building toward the more damning photographs. Mom's initial resistance gradually gave way to confusion, then concern, and finally, something approaching horror as the full scope of Natalie's deception became clear. The photos from the concert were particularly devastating for her. Seeing her daughter in leather pants and intimate contact with her fiancé's brother challenged everything she thought she knew about Natalie's character and values. "This can't be right," she whispered, staring at the image of Natalie wrapped in Kyle's arms. "This doesn't look like her. This doesn't look like anything she would do." "But it is her, Mom. This is who Natalie becomes when she thinks no one from our family is watching. This is the version of herself that she keeps hidden while she manipulates everyone else into believing she's someone completely different." Mom closed the laptop abruptly, as if shutting out the evidence could make it disappear. She walked to the kitchen window and stood with her back to me, her shoulders rigid with the effort of processing information that contradicted fundamental assumptions about her eldest daughter. "Even if this is true," she said finally, "even if Natalie has made some terrible mistakes, destroying her engagement won't help anyone. Derek will be devastated, his family will be humiliated, and Natalie will lose everything she's worked for." The response revealed everything I needed to know about Mom's priorities. Even when confronted with proof of Natalie's systematic deception, her first instinct was to protect Natalie from consequences rather than to consider the people being harmed by her behavior. "What about Derek, Mom? Doesn't he deserve to know who he's really marrying? What about Kyle, who's betraying his own brother? What about me and Tyler and everyone else Natalie has manipulated over the years? You don't understand the bigger picture, Zara. Natalie has always been under enormous pressure to succeed, to be perfect, to make everyone proud. Maybe she's made some poor choices, but that doesn't mean she's a bad person. People can change, especially when they have the stability of marriage to ground them." The rationalization was breathtaking in its scope. Mom was essentially arguing that Natalie's wedding should proceed because marriage might magically transform her into someone capable of honesty and fidelity, despite all evidence to the contrary. So Derek should marry someone who's been cheating on him because it might help her become a better person? That's not fair to him, and it's not realistic about Natalie's willingness to change. Mom turned back to face me, and I could see the desperation in her eyes. She needed to believe that this situation could be resolved without destroying the carefully constructed image of family harmony that she'd spent years maintaining. Maybe we could talk to Natalie. Maybe we could help her understand that she needs to end whatever this is with Kyle and recommit to Derek. She's young, she's confused, but she's not irredeemable. The suggestion revealed how completely Mom misunderstood the nature of what we were dealing with. This wasn't a momentary lapse in judgment or a case of wedding jitters that could be resolved through family intervention. This was evidence of a fundamental character flaw that had been manifesting for years in different contexts. "Mom, this isn't just about the affair. This is about a pattern of behavior that includes destroying my relationship with Tyler, manipulating family situations to benefit herself, and systematically lying to people who trust her. Marriage won't fix someone who doesn't see anything wrong with their actions." But I could see that Mom wasn't ready to accept that analysis. The cognitive dissonance was too great. Acknowledging the full scope of Natalie's capacity for deception would require her to re-examine every family interaction over the past several years. "I need time to think about this," she said finally. "I need to process what you've shown me and figure out how to handle it in a way that minimizes harm to everyone involved." It wasn't the response I'd hoped for, but it wasn't a complete rejection either. Mom had seen the evidence, and despite her initial resistance, I could tell that it had shaken her faith in Natalie's carefully maintained image. "Just promise me that you won't tell Natalie about this conversation yet. If she knows that people are aware of her deception, she might become more careful about covering her tracks, or she might find ways to discredit the evidence. Mom nodded reluctantly. I won't say anything to her right away. But Zara, I hope you understand that I can't let this destroy our family. There has to be a way to handle this that doesn't leave everyone broken. I understood her position, even if I didn't agree with it. Mom had spent decades investing in the mythology of Natalie as the golden child, and abandoning that investment would require her to acknowledge her own role in enabling destructive behavior. As I drove home that night, I reflected on how different the conversation had been from what I'd experienced with Derek. Where Derek had been shocked but ultimately receptive to evidence that contradicted his assumptions, Mom had been primarily concerned with finding ways to minimize the consequences of Natalie's actions. It was a reminder that not everyone would be ready to confront uncomfortable truths, even when those truths were documented and undeniable. Some people were too invested in existing narratives to abandon them, regardless of what new information came to light. But it was also a reminder that I couldn't control other people's responses to the truth. I could only control my own actions and decisions, and I could make sure that innocent people like Derek had access to the information they needed to make informed choices about their lives. My phone buzzed with a text from Marcus. Derek called me tonight. He sounded shaken up, but didn't give me details. Are you okay? Did everything go according to plan? I texted back a brief update, summarizing the day's conversations and their outcomes. Marcus's response came back immediately. Proud of you for having those difficult conversations. Whatever happens next, you've done the right thing by giving people access to the truth. That validation meant more to me than I'd expected. For so long, I'd been conditioned to doubt my own perceptions and to prioritize family harmony over personal integrity. Having someone confirm that my actions were justified helped counteract the gaslighting I'd experienced for years. Tuesday brought an unexpected development that changed the entire dynamic of the situation. I was in my digital marketing seminar when my phone buzzed with an urgent text from Derek. Emergency. Can you meet me at Grind and Brew in 20 minutes? Something's happened with Kyle. I excused myself from class and hurried across campus, my mind racing with possibilities. Had Derek confronted Kyle about the affair? Had Kyle admitted to the relationship? Had something gone wrong with their conversation? I found Derek in the back corner of the coffee shop, looking like he hadn't slept in days. His usually immaculate appearance was disheveled, his hair uncombed and his shirt wrinkled as if he'd slept in it. Derek, what happened? He looked up at me with eyes that were red-rimmed and hollow. I talked to Kyle last night. I showed him the photos you took at the concert. My stomach dropped. How did he react? He didn't deny it. He didn't even try to explain it away or claim it was a misunderstanding. He just looked at the photos and said, I was wondering when someone would figure it out. The casual admission was somehow more shocking than a passionate denial would have been. Kyle's response suggested that he'd been conducting the affair with full awareness of its consequences, without any guilt or concern for the people he was betraying. What else did he say? Derek's laugh was bitter and exhausted. He said he loved her. He said they'd been seeing each other for almost a year, and that she'd promised to call off the engagement after the holidays, but kept finding excuses to delay. He said he was tired of waiting for her to choose him over me. The timeline was even worse than I'd suspected. Natalie and Kyle had been conducting their affair for most of Derek's engagement, meaning that she'd accepted his proposal while actively betraying him with his own brother. Derek, I'm so sorry. I know this is devastating to hear. It gets worse, he continued. Kyle told me that Natalie had been feeding him information about our relationship problems, things I'd confided in her about my family, my insecurities, my concerns about whether I was ready for marriage. She'd been using my private thoughts to bond with Kyle over how incompatible we supposedly were. The manipulation was even more sophisticated than I'd realized. Natalie hadn't just been conducting a physical affair. She'd been systematically undermining Derek's confidence in their relationship while positioning herself as the understanding confidant who truly saw Kyle's worth. "What are you going to do?" Derek was quiet for a long moment, staring into his untouched coffee. "Kyle's leaving town. He's moving to Seattle to stay with friends until he can figure out his next step. He said he can't watch me marry someone who's been lying to both of us, and he can't trust himself not to interfere if he stays." The news should have brought some relief, but instead it created new complications. Kyle's departure would eliminate the most obvious evidence of Natalie's affair, making it harder to prove what had been happening if she chose to deny everything. "Have you decided what you're going to do about Natalie?" "I'm going to confront her tonight. I'm going to tell her that I know about Kyle, and I'm going to give her a chance to explain herself before I make any final decisions about our engagement." Part of me wanted to warn him that Natalie would likely have a prepared response, a carefully crafted explanation that minimized her responsibility while making him feel guilty for doubting her. But Derek was an adult who deserved the opportunity to handle his relationship on his own terms. "Do you want me to be there? As a witness or for moral support?" Derek considered the offer, then shook his head. "I think this needs to be between Natalie and me. But would you be willing to share your documentation with me? If she tries to deny everything or claim that the photos are misleading, I want to have all the evidence available." I transferred all my files to a secure folder and shared the access with Derek, watching as he scrolled through months of careful documentation. The social media analysis, the timeline correlations, the concert photos, even some additional evidence I'd gathered but hadn't shared yet. "This is incredibly thorough," he said, his voice filled with a mixture of admiration and sadness. "You've essentially conducted a complete investigation into her deception." I had to be thorough. I knew that if I was going to make accusations this serious, I needed to be absolutely certain of my facts. Derek closed his laptop and looked at me with something approaching gratitude. "Zara, I know this couldn't have been easy for you. Investigating your own sister, documenting her betrayal, having those difficult conversations with your mother and with me. Why did you do it?" The question deserved an honest answer. Because I was tired of watching her hurt people while pretending to be something she's not. Because, Derek, you deserve better than someone who sees your trust as weakness to be exploited. And because I finally realized that protecting Natalie from consequences wasn't helping anyone, including her. "What do you think will happen when I confront her tonight?" I considered the question carefully, drawing on everything I'd learned about Natalie's psychology over the years. She'll try to control the narrative. She'll probably admit to some limited version of what happened while minimizing her responsibility and making you feel like you're overreacting. She might claim that Kyle pursued her and she made a mistake, or that she was confused about her feelings but never meant to hurt you. Derek nodded grimly. "And if I don't accept those explanations?" "Then she'll get angry. She'll accuse you of not trusting her, of believing outsiders over the woman you're supposed to marry. She might even try to turn this back on me, claiming that I've manipulated you because I'm jealous of her happiness." Will any of that work? I looked at Derek's exhausted but determined face and felt a surge of confidence in his ability to see through Natalie's manipulation. "Not anymore. You've seen too much evidence and you know too much about her capacity for deception. Once you understand how someone operates, their techniques stop being effective." Derek finished his coffee and gathered his things, preparing for what would likely be one of the most difficult conversations of his life. As he stood to leave, he turned back to me with an expression of resolve that reminded me why Natalie had been drawn to him in the first place. "Whatever happens tonight, I want you to know that I'm grateful you told me the truth. I'd rather face reality than build my life on comfortable lies." After Derek left, I sat in the coffee shop for another hour, processing the rapid developments of the past few days. The careful investigation I'd conducted was finally producing results, but those results were more complicated and far-reaching than I'd anticipated. Kyle's decision to leave town eliminated one source of ongoing deception, but potentially made it harder to prove what had been happening. Mom's resistance to accepting the full scope of Natalie's manipulation meant that family relationships would likely remain strained, regardless of how the immediate crisis was resolved. And Natalie herself remained an unknown factor. How would she respond when confronted with evidence of her systematic deception? Would she finally accept responsibility for her actions, or would she double down on manipulation and denial? My phone buzzed with a text from Priya. Heard through the grapevine that something big is happening with your family situation. Are you okay? Do you need backup tonight? The offer of support reminded me that I wasn't facing this situation alone. I'd built genuine friendships and connections that existed independently of Natalie's influence, relationships based on mutual respect and honesty rather than manipulation and control. Those relationships were proof that it was possible to interact with people without constant deception, that trust could exist without exploitation, and that caring about someone didn't require controlling every aspect of their life. Whatever happened when Derek confronted Natalie, whatever fallout resulted from the exposure of her deception, I would face it with the knowledge that I'd finally chosen truth over convenient fiction. The quiet, accommodating sister who had spent years absorbing manipulation without fighting back was gone. In her place was someone who understood that protecting the innocent sometimes required exposing the guilty, and that real love sometimes meant allowing people to face the consequences of their choices. Tonight, Natalie would finally be forced to confront the reality of what she'd done and who she'd become. And for the first time in years, I was genuinely curious to see how she would respond when her carefully constructed facade finally crumbled under the weight of documented truth. The call came at 11:30 that night, jarring me awake from restless sleep filled with anxiety about Derek's confrontation with Natalie. My phone screen showed Derek's name, and I answered immediately, still groggy but alert enough to recognize the gravity of receiving a call at this hour. "Zara, I need you to come over. Now. Natalie's here, and everything's falling apart." His voice carried a strange mixture of exhaustion and determination that made my stomach clench with apprehension. In the background, I could hear raised voices, though I couldn't make out specific words. "Derek, what's happening? Are you safe?" "I'm fine, but I need a witness. She's denying everything, claiming the photos are fake, saying you've manipulated me because you're jealous of our relationship. I need someone here who can verify the evidence and isn't emotionally invested in protecting her." The request put me in an impossible position. Part of me wanted to rush over immediately, to finally confront Natalie face-to-face about years of manipulation and betrayal. But another part recognized that inserting myself into their relationship crisis could backfire spectacularly, giving Natalie ammunition to claim that I was orchestrating the entire situation for my own vindictive purposes. "Derek, are you sure you want me there? This is your relationship, and having me present might make things more complicated." "She's already made it about you. She's spent the last hour claiming that you've been plotting against her, that you fabricated evidence because you can't stand seeing her happy. I need you here to set the record straight." The background voices were getting louder, and I could now distinguish Natalie's sharp tone cutting through what sounded like Derek's attempts at reasonable conversation. She was in full crisis management mode, deploying every manipulation technique in her arsenal to regain control of the narrative. "I'll be there in 20 minutes. I threw on clothes and drove through the empty streets of Cedar Valley, my mind racing with strategies for the confrontation ahead. Natalie would be at her most dangerous right now, cornered and desperate to preserve the life she'd constructed through systematic deception. She would use every weapon available to her: emotional manipulation, victim playing, family loyalty, even threats of self-harm if she thought it would generate sympathy. But she would also be operating from a position of fundamental weakness. The evidence against her was overwhelming and documented. Kyle had already confessed to his role in the affair, and her denials would become increasingly absurd as more facts came to light. Derek's apartment complex sat in the newer part of town, all clean lines and modern amenities that reflected his family's wealth and status. I could see lights blazing in his third-floor unit as I climbed the stairs, and the sound of raised voices became clearer with each step. Derek opened the door before I could knock, his face haggard but resolute. Behind him, I could see Natalie, pacing near the living room windows, her carefully styled hair disheveled and her makeup smeared from what appeared to have been tears of frustration rather than genuine emotion. "Thank you for coming," Derek said quietly, stepping aside to let me enter. Natalie whirled around as soon as she saw me, her expression shifting from calculated vulnerability to pure fury in the space of a heartbeat. Of course you called her. This is exactly what she wanted, isn't it, Zara? You've been planning this for months, haven't you?" The accusation was delivered with the kind of righteous indignation that might have been convincing if I hadn't spent weeks documenting her systematic deception. But now, watching her perform outrage while standing in Derek's apartment at midnight, surrounded by evidence of her own betrayal, the manipulation was transparently obvious. "I didn't plan anything, Natalie. I just documented what you were already doing." "What I was already doing." She laughed, but the sound was sharp and bitter rather than amused. "You mean living my life? Dating my fiancé? Planning our wedding? You've turned completely innocent interactions into some elaborate conspiracy theory because you can't stand that I'm happy." Derek moved to his laptop, which was open on the coffee table displaying the folder of evidence I'd shared with him. "Natalie, these aren't innocent interactions. These are photos of you and Kyle at a concert, photos of you kissing him in a parking lot, documentation of you lying about your whereabouts while you were with him." Natalie's response was immediate and predictable. She rushed to Derek's side, placing her hands on his shoulders with the kind of intimate familiarity that was designed to remind him of their physical connection. "Derek, honey, those photos could be anyone. They're dark. They're taken from a distance. And you know how much Zara resents me. She could have easily staged something like this with actors or used photo editing software to make it look like me." The suggestion was so absurd that I almost laughed. Natalie was essentially claiming that I had hired actors to impersonate her and Kyle, then staged an elaborate concert scenario complete with authentic social media posts and timeline correlations, all for the purpose of destroying her engagement. "Natalie," Derek said, his voice carrying a patience that was clearly strained to its limits, "Kyle already admitted everything. He told me about the affair, about the promises you made him, about how long it's been going on. Are you saying he's lying too?" For the first time since I'd arrived, Natalie's composure cracked visibly. She stepped back from Derek, her hands falling to her sides as she processed the information that Kyle had confessed. "Kyle said that? He actually admitted to having an affair with me?" "He did more than admit it," Derek continued. "He told me details about your relationship that only someone intimate with you would know. He told me about conversations you'd had about our engagement, about things I'd confided in you that you shared with him." Natalie's face went through a series of rapid transformations as she calculated her options. I could almost see her mental gears turning, trying to construct a new narrative that could accommodate Kyle's confession while minimizing her own responsibility. "Derek, I can explain everything. Kyle has been pursuing me for months, making me uncomfortable, putting me in impossible situations. I tried to handle it quietly because I didn't want to cause problems between you and your brother, but he became increasingly aggressive." The pivot was masterful in its audacity. Natalie was now positioning herself as the victim of Kyle's unwanted advances, the loyal fiancé who had been trying to protect Derek from painful family drama. "So when Kyle was pursuing you aggressively," I said, unable to remain silent any longer, "you responded by going to underground concerts with him? By posting coordinated social media alibis to cover your meetings? by wrapping your arms around him during intimate moments. Natalie's gaze turned to me with the kind of hatred that was no longer masked by sisterly concern. You have no idea what you're talking about. You weren't there, you don't understand the context, and you're twisting everything to fit your vindictive narrative. Then explain the context, Derek said, his voice growing stronger. Explain why you were at a concert you claim to hate, with music you supposedly can't stand, dressed like someone I've never seen before, engaging in intimate contact with my brother. Natalie opened her mouth to respond, then closed it again, as she realized that any explanation would require her to admit to fundamental deceptions about her personality and preferences. She couldn't claim that Kyle had forced her to attend the concert without explaining why she'd dressed the part so convincingly. She couldn't dismiss the intimate contact as unwanted without explaining why she'd initiated much of it herself. The photos don't show the whole story, she said finally, her voice taking on a pleading quality that sounded more genuine than anything else she'd said that night. Derek, you know me. You know I would never deliberately hurt you. Whatever mistakes I might have made, they came from a place of confusion, not malice. It was exactly the response I'd predicted. A limited admission wrapped in claims of victimhood and appeals to Derek's emotional connection to her. Natalie was betting that Derek's love for the woman he thought she was would override the evidence of who she actually turned out to be. Derek looked at her for a long moment, and I could see him struggling with the disconnect between his feelings for the Natalie he'd fallen in love with and the reality of the person standing before him. The woman I fell in love with wouldn't have been capable of this level of deception, he said quietly. The woman I fell in love with valued honesty and communication above everything else. She wouldn't have conducted a year-long affair while planning our wedding. She wouldn't have manipulated family relationships to serve her own interests. I am that woman, Natalie insisted, moving closer to him again. I made mistakes. I got confused. But underneath all of this, I'm still the person you fell in love with. We can work through this, Derek. We can get counseling. We can rebuild trust. We can still have the marriage we planned. Can we? Derek asked. Because part of working through this would require you to take full responsibility for your choices. It would require you to acknowledge the scope of your deception and commit to complete honesty going forward. Are you prepared to do that? Natalie hesitated, and in that hesitation, everything became clear. She wasn't prepared to take full responsibility, because doing so would require her to abandon the victim narrative she was constructing. She couldn't commit to complete honesty, because her entire approach to relationships was built on manipulation and control. Derek, I think you're being influenced by people who don't have our best interests at heart, she said, glancing meaningfully in my direction. Zara has never supported our relationship, and now she's found a way to poison you against me using half-truths and misrepresentations. The accusation was Natalie's final gambit, an attempt to redirect Derek's anger toward me while positioning herself as the victim of a family conspiracy. But it was also a tactical error that revealed her fundamental misunderstanding of how much the evidence had changed Derek's perspective. Natalie, Derek said, his voice now carrying a finality that hadn't been there before. Zara didn't poison me against you. Your own actions did that. The evidence speaks for itself, Kyle's confession confirms it, and your responses tonight have only made it worse. So that's it? Natalie's voice was rising again, but now it carried genuine panic rather than calculated emotion. You're going to throw away everything we've built together because of some photos and accusations from people who want to see me fail? I'm not throwing anything away, Derek replied. You already destroyed what we built when you chose to conduct an affair with my brother while planning our wedding. I'm just finally acknowledging that reality. The silence that followed was heavy with implications that even Natalie couldn't deny or deflect. Her carefully constructed facade was crumbling in real time, and she was being forced to confront the consequences of choices she'd thought she could hide indefinitely. "What about the wedding?" she asked, her voice now small and desperate. "What about our families, our plans, everything we've already paid for?" "The wedding is canceled," Derek said simply. "I'll handle explaining the situation to my family, and you can decide how much you want to tell yours. But I won't marry someone I can't trust, and I can't trust someone who's capable of this level of systematic deception." Natalie looked between Derek and me, and I could see her mentally cycling through her remaining options. The appeals to emotion had failed, the victim narrative had been rejected, and the attempts to redirect blame had been unsuccessful. She was facing the collapse of everything she'd worked to achieve, and she had no tools left to prevent it. "Fine," she said, her voice hardening with resentment. "Fine. But don't think this is over, Zara. You've destroyed my life tonight, and I won't forget that." The threat was exactly what I'd expected, but it also represented a fundamental misunderstanding of the situation. Natalie still believed that I was responsible for her downfall, rather than recognizing that her own choices had created the circumstances that led to this moment. "I didn't destroy your life, Natalie. I just made sure that people had access to the truth about your choices. Everything that happened tonight was a consequence of decisions you made freely over the course of many months." She stared at me with undisguised hatred, no longer bothering to maintain the pretense of sisterly affection. "You always resented me. You couldn't stand that I was successful, that I was loved, that I had everything you wanted. This was your chance to tear me down, and you took it." "This was never about tearing you down," I replied. "This was about protecting innocent people from manipulation and deception. Derek deserved to know who he was really marrying, just like Tyler deserved to know that you were lying about me." The mention of Tyler caused Natalie's expression to shift again, this time toward something approaching surprise. She'd apparently forgotten that her sabotage of my relationship had been the catalyst for everything that followed. "Tyler was never right for you anyway," she said, falling back on the justification she'd probably been telling herself for months. "I was protecting you from making a mistake." "You were protecting yourself from having to share attention," I corrected. "You couldn't stand that I was building a relationship that didn't depend on your approval or involvement." Derek had been watching this exchange with growing understanding of the family dynamics that had shaped both Natalie and me. "How long has this been going on?" he asked. "How long have you been manipulating situations to maintain control over other people's relationships?" Natalie didn't answer, but she didn't need to. The pattern was clear now that it had been exposed. Years of subtle sabotage, carefully placed doubts, strategic information sharing designed to undermine any connection that threatened her position as the center of attention. "I think you should leave," Derek said finally. "I think you should take some time to process what's happened tonight and decide how you want to handle this going forward." Natalie gathered her purse and jacket with movements that were sharp and angry, no longer bothering to maintain the graceful composure that had been part of her performance for so long. "This isn't over," she repeated, looking directly at me. "You think you've won something here tonight, but all you've done is prove that you're vindictive and jealous. Everyone will see that eventually." After she left, Derek and I sat in his living room surrounded by the wreckage of what had been, just hours earlier, a relationship that was heading toward marriage. The evidence was still displayed on his laptop screen, but it no longer seemed necessary. Natalie's responses to the confrontation had been more damning than any photos or documentation. "Are you okay?" I asked, though I could see that he was far from okay. Derek was quiet for a long time, staring at the closed door through which Natalie had just departed. "I keep thinking about all the times I sensed that something was off, all the moments when her explanations didn't quite add up, or her behavior seemed inconsistent with her stated values. I knew something was wrong, but I kept telling myself I was being paranoid. She's very good at making people doubt their own perceptions. That's part of how the manipulation works." How did you figure it out? How did you see through what I couldn't? I considered the question carefully, thinking about the years of conditioning that had taught me to notice discrepancies between Natalie's public image and her private behavior. I had practice. She'd been manipulating me for so long that I'd learned to recognize the techniques, even when I wasn't consciously aware of what was happening. When she sabotaged my relationship with Tyler, it was just obvious enough that I couldn't ignore it anymore. Derek nodded slowly. I'm grateful you told me, even though it's destroying everything I thought I knew about my life. I'd rather face reality than build my future on lies. What will you tell your family? The truth. Kyle's already gone, so they'll need to understand why he left so suddenly. And they deserve to know why the wedding is canceled before they invest any more time or money in celebrating a relationship that was built on deception. The conversation continued for another hour as Derek processed the implications of everything he'd learned. His pain was evident, but so was his relief at finally understanding the source of the persistent unease that had been troubling him for months. When I finally left his apartment, it was nearly 3 a.m, and the streets of Cedar Valley were completely empty. As I drove home, I reflected on how different this confrontation had been from what I'd imagined during the weeks of investigation and evidence gathering. There had been no dramatic revelations or satisfying moments of vindication. Instead, there had been the slow, grinding work of exposing deception and the painful process of watching someone realize that their entire understanding of an important relationship had been based on lies. But there had also been something else. The quiet satisfaction of knowing that innocent people were now protected from ongoing manipulation, and that truth had finally been given the chance to compete with carefully constructed fiction. My phone buzzed with a text from Priya. Saw lights on in Derek's apartment when I drove by earlier. Hope everything went as well as could be expected. Proud of you for seeing this through. The support meant more than I could express. For so long, I'd been conditioned to prioritize family loyalty over personal integrity, to maintain peace at the expense of truth. Having friends who validated my choice to expose deception rather than enable it reminded me that healthy relationships were built on honesty rather than manipulation. As I pulled into my apartment complex, I realized that this confrontation was probably just the beginning rather than the end of the fallout from Natalie's exposed deception. She would likely spend the coming days and weeks constructing new narratives, designed to minimize her responsibility and redirect blame toward me. But I was no longer the scared, accommodating sister who would accept that manipulation without fighting back. I had documentation, witnesses, and most importantly, the confidence that came from finally understanding the difference between protecting someone from consequences and enabling their destructive behavior. Natalie had taught me valuable lessons about trust, family loyalty, and the importance of maintaining personal integrity, even when it meant confronting uncomfortable truths. Now it was time for her to learn what happened when the quiet sister finally decided to stop being quiet. 3 weeks passed in relative silence after that midnight confrontation at Derek's apartment. The immediate aftermath had been surprisingly quiet, like the eerie calm that follows a devastating storm. I'd expected Natalie to launch an immediate counterattack, to flood our family and social circles with her version of events, designed to paint me as the vindictive sister who had destroyed her happiness out of pure jealousy. Instead, she seemed to have disappeared entirely from Cedar Valley's social scene. Her usually active social media accounts went dark, except for a single, carefully worded post about taking time for personal reflection and growth. No wedding? Updates, no engagement photos, no cheerful announcements about charity work or academic achievements. The silence was almost more unnerving than her usual manipulation would have been. Derek, meanwhile, had handled the situation with a grace that reinforced everything good I'd thought about him. He'd spoken privately with his parents, explaining the cancellation in terms that protected their feelings, while making clear that the decision was final. The engagement ring had been returned, deposits forfeited, and wedding vendors notified with diplomatic explanations about irreconcilable differences. Kyle had indeed moved to Seattle as promised, finding work with a music production company, and cutting all ties with Cedar Valley except for occasional check-ins with Derek to ensure their brotherly relationship could eventually heal. I was beginning to think that maybe, just maybe, the crisis had passed without the explosive fallout I'd anticipated. Maybe Natalie had actually taken time for genuine self-reflection. Maybe she'd recognized the destructiveness of her behavior and was working on becoming the person she'd always pretended to be. I should have known better. The first sign that Natalie's silence had been strategic rather than reflective came on a Thursday morning when I arrived at my internship to find my supervisor, Janet Morrison, waiting in her office with an expression of professional concern that immediately set my nerves on edge. "Zara, I need to speak with you about something sensitive that's come to my attention. Please, have a seat." Janet was the kind of woman who had built her marketing consultancy through 30 years of hard work and ethical business practices. She'd been mentoring me for 6 months, and her recommendation would be crucial for my prospects after graduation. The gravity in her voice suggested that whatever conversation was about to unfold could jeopardize everything I'd worked to achieve. "I received a concerning phone call yesterday from someone claiming to be your sister. She expressed worry about your mental health and suggested that you might be engaging in some troubling behaviors that could affect your work here." My stomach dropped as the implications became clear. Natalie hadn't been reflecting or growing during her weeks of silence. She'd been planning a calculated attack designed to undermine my professional reputation and future prospects. What specific behaviors did she claim to be concerned about? Janet consulted her notes with the careful precision that had made her successful in client relations. She mentioned obsessive behaviors, paranoid thinking, and a tendency to construct elaborate conspiracy theories about people close to you. She said you'd recently destroyed her engagement by fabricating evidence of infidelity, and that she was worried you might bring similar instability to your professional relationships. The revision was masterful in its psychological sophistication. Natalie had taken the documented evidence of her affair and reframed it as my delusional fabrication. She'd transformed her systematic deception into my mental health crisis, positioning herself as the concerned sister trying to protect innocent people from my supposedly unstable behavior. "Janet, I can provide you with extensive documentation proving that everything I reported about my sister was factually accurate. I have photographs, timeline analysis, witness testimony, and even a confession from the man she was having an affair with." "I'm sure you believe you have evidence," Janet said gently, and I could hear in her tone that Natalie's manipulation was already working. "But your sister mentioned that you've become very skilled at using technology to create convincing but false documentation. She said you've been studying digital marketing long enough to know how to manipulate images and social media evidence." The brilliance of the attack was breathtaking. Natalie had used my own professional skills against me, suggesting that my expertise in digital marketing made me uniquely capable of fabricating the very evidence that had exposed her deception. She'd taken my strengths and turned them into reasons to doubt my credibility. "Janet, I understand why this might be confusing, but I need you to consider the possibility that my sister is the one who's being deceptive here. The evidence I gathered wasn't fabricated, and the people involved have already confirmed its accuracy." Janet's expression remained sympathetic but skeptical. "Zara, I've worked with you for months, and I've never seen any signs of the behaviors your sister described. But I also have to consider the possibility that someone close to you knows you better than I do, and might recognize warning signs that aren't apparent in a professional setting." The conversation continued for another 20 minutes, with Janet explaining that while she wasn't taking any immediate action, she would be monitoring the situation and encouraged me to seek support if I was dealing with mental health challenges. Her language was careful and kind, but the underlying message was clear. My professional reputation had been compromised, and my future with the company was now in question. After leaving Janet's office, I sat in my car in the parking lot and called Derek immediately. When he answered, his voice carried the same exhausted quality it had held since our confrontation with Natalie. "Derek, she started attacking me professionally. She called my internship supervisor and claimed I fabricated all the evidence against her." There was a long pause before Derek responded. "She called my parents too. Yesterday afternoon, she told them that she's been trying to help you through some kind of mental health crisis, and that you'd become obsessed with destroying her relationship because you couldn't handle your own romantic failures." The systematic nature of Natalie's counterattack was becoming clear. She wasn't just trying to discredit me with one or two key people. She was conducting a comprehensive campaign designed to reframe the entire narrative around my supposed psychological instability. "Did your parents believe her?" "At first they were confused and concerned, but then I showed them some of the evidence you'd gathered, and I told them about Kyle's confession before he left for Seattle. My mother actually called Kyle directly to verify the story." Relief flooded through me. What did Kyle tell her? The truth. Everything. He told my mother that he and Natalie had been having an affair for almost a year, that he'd confessed everything to me, and that he'd moved to Seattle because he couldn't handle watching me marry someone who had betrayed both of us. "How did your mother react?" Derek's laugh was bitter. She was horrified, not just about the affair, but about Natalie's attempt to gaslight everyone about what had really happened. My mother has dealt with enough family drama over the years to recognize manipulation when she sees it. The support from Derek's family was encouraging, but I realized that Natalie's campaign was probably just beginning. She would likely contact my professors, my friends, possibly even my mother, spreading carefully crafted versions of events designed to isolate me and undermine my credibility. "Derek, I think we need to be proactive about this. We can't just wait for her to contact everyone we know and hope they'll believe our side of the story." "What do you suggest?" "I think we need to compile all the evidence into a comprehensive package and share it with the key people in our lives before Natalie can poison them against us. Let them see the documentation for themselves and make their own judgments." Derek agreed, and we spent the next several hours creating what we called the Truth Package, a carefully organized collection of evidence that included the original photos, social media analysis, timeline correlations, and written statements from both Derek and Kyle confirming the accuracy of our account. The package was designed to be overwhelming in its thoroughness, while remaining completely factual and verifiable. Anyone who took the time to review it would be forced to conclude that either the evidence was genuine or that Derek, Kyle, and I had participated in an impossibly elaborate conspiracy to frame Natalie for behavior that had actually occurred. We sent the package to Derek's extended family, my professors, and several mutual friends who were likely targets for Natalie's manipulation campaign. Each transmission was accompanied by a brief note explaining that we were sharing this information proactively because we had reason to believe that false claims were being made about the events in question. The responses began arriving within hours, and they were more supportive than I'd dared to hope. Derek's aunt, who worked in corporate law, replied with a message that read, "This documentation is incredibly thorough and compelling. If someone is claiming this evidence was fabricated, they're essentially accusing you of committing fraud on a scale that would require professional expertise and significant resources. That accusation is more implausible than the simpler explanation that the evidence is genuine." My favorite professor, Dr. Zara Patel, who taught advanced digital marketing ethics, sent a particularly validating response. "I've reviewed your documentation with the eye of someone who teaches students how to detect manipulated digital content. Everything you've provided appears authentic and unaltered. Moreover, the sophistication required to fabricate evidence of this quality would far exceed the capabilities of most undergraduate students." But the most important response came from my mother, who called me directly after receiving the package. "Zara, I owe you an apology. When you first tried to tell me about Natalie's behavior, I dismissed your concerns because I didn't want to believe them. After seeing this evidence and reading Derek's statement, I understand that you were trying to protect innocent people from deception. The validation from Mom was more meaningful than I'd expected. For so long, I'd been conditioned to doubt my own perceptions and defer to Natalie's version of events. Having my mother acknowledge that my concerns had been legitimate helped heal wounds I didn't even realize were still bleeding. Mom, I know this is painful to accept about Natalie. I never wanted to hurt our family. You didn't hurt our family, sweetheart. Natalie did that when she chose deception over honesty. What you did was make sure that the truth eventually came to light. Our conversation continued for over an hour, with Mom sharing observations about Natalie's behavior over the years that she'd previously dismissed or rationalized. Patterns of manipulation that had been invisible when viewed individually became obvious when considered as part of a larger system of control and deception. The next phase of Natalie's counterattack came 2 days later, when she returned to social media with a carefully crafted post that was designed to generate sympathy while subtly reinforcing her claims about my mental health. During this difficult time of personal growth and family crisis, I've learned the importance of setting boundaries with people whose mental health struggles cause them to lash out at those who love them most. Sometimes the most compassionate thing you can do is step back and allow someone to get the professional help they need, even when they're not ready to recognize that need themselves. Sending love and prayers to my family as we navigate this challenging situation. The post was a masterpiece of manipulation, managing to sound loving and concerned while reinforcing the narrative that I was mentally unstable and that she was the victim of my psychological problems. She'd positioned herself as the mature family member making difficult but necessary decisions to protect everyone's well-being. But the response to her post revealed that her manipulation campaign wasn't working as effectively as she'd hoped. Several comments from people who had received our truth package pointed out inconsistencies in her narrative, while others shared their own experiences with her deceptive behavior. Marcus Chen, Derek's former roommate, left a particularly damning comment. Interesting perspective, Natalie. I'm curious how this family crisis explains the confession Kyle made to Derek before moving to Seattle, or the documented timeline of your whereabouts during your affair. Unless you're suggesting that Derek and Kyle are also experiencing mental health crises that cause them to fabricate matching stories? The comment thread that followed Marcus's post became a public forum for people to share their own experiences, with Natalie's manipulation creating exactly the kind of documentation that she'd been trying to prevent. Her attempt to control the narrative through social media had backfired spectacularly, generating a permanent record of multiple people challenging her version of events. Realizing that her manipulation campaign was failing, Natalie made one final, desperate attempt to regain control of the situation. She contacted Dr. Rebecca Torres, the family therapist who had provided marriage counseling to our parents during their divorce, and requested a session to address what she claimed was a family crisis caused by my deteriorating mental health. Dr. Torres, who had maintained professional relationships with our family for over a decade, agreed to mediate a conversation between Natalie and me, provided that I consented to participate. When Dr. Torres called to extend the invitation, she was careful to explain that she wasn't making any judgments about the situation and was simply offering to provide a neutral space for family communication. I've received some concerning information from both you and your sister about recent family conflicts. I think it might be helpful for you both to have a facilitated conversation in a professional setting. I agreed to the session, recognizing it as an opportunity to present the truth, in a context where Natalie's usual manipulation techniques would be less effective. Professional therapists were trained to recognize deceptive behavior patterns, and Dr. Torres had years of experience dealing with family members who used mental health concerns as weapons against each other. The session took place on a gray, February afternoon in Dr. Torres's office, a comfortable space designed to encourage honest communication. Natalie arrived first, dressed in muted colors that suggested vulnerability rather than confidence, already positioning herself as the Concerned family member seeking help for a troubled sister. I arrived with a printed copy of our truth package, not as a weapon to attack Natalie, but as documentation that could provide context for the conversation that was about to unfold. Dr. Torres began by establishing ground rules for productive communication, then invited Natalie to share her perspective on the family situation. Natalie's presentation was everything I'd expected. Carefully modulated concern about my mental health, gentle suggestions that I was struggling with delusions and obsessive behaviors, and repeated assertions that she only wanted to help me get the professional support I needed. I love my sister, but I'm genuinely worried about her well-being. She's become fixated on destroying my relationship, and she's created this elaborate fantasy where I'm the villain in her story. I think she needs professional help, and I hope she'll be open to getting it. When Dr. Torres invited me to respond, I calmly presented the documentation I'd brought, explaining that I understood Natalie's concerns but wanted to provide factual context for the events in question. Dr. Torres reviewed the evidence with the careful attention of someone trained to distinguish between legitimate concerns and manipulative narratives. The photos, timeline analysis, and written statements from Derek and Kyle created a comprehensive picture that was impossible to dismiss as delusion or fabrication. Natalie, Dr. Torres said finally, I'm having difficulty understanding how your sister could have fabricated evidence of this scope and complexity. The documentation includes independent verification from multiple sources, including your former fiancé and his brother. Are you suggesting that all of these people participated in an elaborate conspiracy against you? The question exposed the fundamental flaw in Natalie's manipulation campaign. Her claims about my mental health required everyone else involved to be either delusional or actively conspiring against her, which was far more implausible than the simple explanation that the evidence was genuine. Natalie's response revealed the desperation that had been driving her counterattack. Dr. Torres, you don't understand how manipulative Zara can be. She's always been jealous of my success, and she's spent months planning this attack. She's turned everyone against me using lies and fabricated evidence. But the evidence includes a confession from Kyle Hamilton, who had no apparent motive, to lie about his relationship with you. He's Derek's brother, so falsely admitting to an affair would damage his own family relationships. Why would he fabricate something so harmful to himself? Natalie didn't have an answer for that question, because there was no answer that didn't require acknowledging the truth of what had happened. The session continued for another hour, with Dr. Torres systematically dismantling each of Natalie's claims through careful questioning and reference to the documented evidence. By the end, it was clear that even Natalie understood that her manipulation campaign had failed definitively. Natalie, Dr. Torres said in conclusion, I think you need to consider the possibility that your sister's actions weren't motivated by mental illness or jealousy, but by a legitimate desire to protect innocent people from deception. The evidence she's presented is compelling and well documented, and her behavior throughout this process has been measured and appropriate. As we left Dr. Torres's office, Natalie and I walked to the parking lot in silence. When we reached our cars, she turned to face me with an expression that was no longer masked by manipulation or pretense. You won, she said simply. Are you happy now? The question revealed that Natalie still didn't understand what had actually happened. She thought this had been a competition between us, a battle for dominance that I had somehow managed to win through superior strategy. This was never about winning, Natalie. This was about truth. This was about protecting people who trusted you from being manipulated and deceived. And what about protecting me? What about considering that I might have been confused or making mistakes rather than being deliberately malicious? It was the closest thing to an acknowledgement of wrongdoing that I'd ever heard from her, but it was still framed as a request for sympathy rather than an acceptance of responsibility. Protection doesn't mean enabling destructive behavior. It means caring enough about someone to hold them accountable when they hurt innocent people. Natalie stared at me for a long moment, and I could see her struggling with concepts that were foreign to her worldview. Accountability, consequences, the possibility that other people's well-being might be more important than her own comfort. "What happens now?" she asked. "Now you decide who you want to be going forward. You can keep trying to manipulate people and blame others for the consequences of your choices, or you can accept responsibility and work on becoming someone worthy of the trust you've been taking for granted." We parted ways that afternoon, with an understanding that our relationship had fundamentally changed. I was no longer the accommodating little sister who would absorb manipulation without fighting back, and she was no longer the golden child whose behavior would be excused regardless of how much damage it caused. 6 months later, I graduated with honors and accepted a position with a digital marketing firm in Portland. Derek had healed from his broken engagement and was dating someone new, someone who valued honesty and communication above image management. Kyle had found success with his music career and had rebuilt his relationship with his brother based on mutual respect and genuine remorse for past mistakes. And Natalie had eventually entered therapy, not because anyone forced her to, but because she'd finally recognized that her patterns of manipulation were preventing her from building the authentic relationships she'd always claimed to want. The quiet sister who had spent years being invisible had learned that sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is refuse to stay silent when silence enables harm. Sometimes love means holding people accountable. Sometimes family loyalty means choosing truth over comfort. And sometimes the best revenge isn't revenge at all. Sometimes it's just refusing to let manipulative people rewrite reality to suit their convenience. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.